Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that, the shading layer, I've merged that down into the actual drawing. Make a separate save of this file before you do that, in case you ever need to go back and get the original drawing for fixes. But what I've done is I've merged it down so that it's an entire one layer shaded drawing, and then I'm using the dodge tool set to midtones. I'm going in there to basically bring up small detailed highlights. It's sort of like going back and adding to the drawing again, except with a positive white as opposed to adding black. So what I'm going in, I'm adding little bits like reflections, I'm accentuating the line within the drawing. So if there's a particularly heavy or important black line, I'll often have a highlight line near it. Certain areas like the teeth, where they're going to be especially shiny and bright, I'll go in there, as I'm doing now, and add in the edging to those, so those read much better. And that'll work well with the glazing in the later stages. The reason I'm doing the highlights set to midtones is so I don't end up obscuring or working over the texture that's already in place. That was less of an issue when I was shading, when I had it set to highlights. Mostly because the shading was sitting on top of the texture, so it was pushing the texture down and working on top of everything. But with the highlights, I don't want to end up obscuring the texture too much, so I don't have it set to shadows or highlights for the dodging phase. The shinier the material is, usually the brighter the added white line work will end up, like on this this leather and on the buttons as well. So usually there's more of a contrast going on there, even here in the staging step, simply to illustrate the materials being used on the object that I'm shading. More so than in the shading step, when you're doing these small, delicate highlights, the pressure sensitivity of your tablet and your pen is quite helpful. The fact that you can bring these little highlights to a very thin, striking, tapering point, and then bring it out and sort of fade it off a little bit as you let it go, really can do a lot of work for you as you do this, especially in places like these tassel ends where you can bring it right down to the edge, and then sort of ease it off as they curve in under shadow. Working around the head, which is the focal point in this case, you can really get away with going into a lot of detail because that's perfectly fine to bring the viewer's eye to this point, because they'll always be drawn to the eyes naturally. Hair could be treated in a huge amount of different ways, and you should always try and make them suit the character. So for this, it's a matted tangle of sort of tufts. So I'm treating them as small clumps and groups of hair, as opposed to a large full body of hair, which I'm applying effects to and treating. Now, depending upon how precise or how large the shading area I want to apply, or the highlighting area I want to apply is, I can just enlarge or shrink the airbrush size. I have that set to the two little buttons on my Wacom pen. So I can flip up and down easily depending on what area of the artwork I'm working on as I go through it. So now I've been flipping up between sort of 7 to 10 to 20 size as I'm going through the face and the upper area of the zombie. I mean, basically what I'm doing here is you want to explain the design you've made as much as you can so it visually reads easily. If there's any areas that could be potentially confusing or muddled, these steps are basically bringing those out and clearing those up so that it's easier to see. I often press the Alt key here, and what I'll do is it actually switch it from dodge to burn. So I quickly darkened up those buttons, some areas that were getting a little faded off as I'm moving through. I might want to have done that in a full darkening pass, which I'll actually probably go back to and do later on. But as I'm moving through and notice things, I like to just quickly fix them up if I think I can as I'm going along my way without stopping the momentum too much. For these straight bayonet edges, I'll actually switch to the mouse oftentimes, click on one edge, and then if I want it to go in a direct line, I'll press Shift and then click on the destination point, and it'll draw the airbrush right across in a perfectly connecting line. For straight edge bits like metal and things like that. It's really helpful. Some of the highlighting steps actually may not even really contribute anything directly to the piece, but are actually removing sort of small scuffs or bits where the line has become too thick and heavy. I'll thin that out. Flecks and things like that that start to show up, I'll actually quickly use the highlight tool to fix up. The same goes for any sort of faded off bits. I'll quickly go and use the burn tool. You can see here where actually the fingernails have gotten to the point where they're at the scale where I've decided to forego making them ragged or damaged badly. I've left them relatively intact to show that he still has them on. The key thing about these tassels is you want to accentuate the folds that curve outwards, sort of on top of the bunch, and then you leave the ones that curl under other ones alone, and it'll give it more depth, adding in that variance of value. Of course, you do have to stay aware that the value relatively will end up changing on different parts of the design during the glazing process, because that'll end up affecting it depending on how many layers you put on and what color, what hues you choose. The great thing about the Dodge Midtones tool is the way it can just dig into those shadows there as I curl it around the top lip of the boot. The problem is set on shadows it would be too indiscriminate, and highlights wouldn't affect the black enough. You can see here, even though those buttons were basically sort of very uniform blotches of dark, I was able to draw into them with this white highlighting and really bring them out. I was conscious that they were there and that's how they'd appear, but the drawing was obviously somewhat vague until I went in and finished them off with this step. Some areas I may forego highlighting at all, depending on the on how it may end up catching the light. Of course, other areas, especially exceptionally shiny areas, I may underdo the shading at this point, and then go back and use the Dodge tool again on top of a flattened version, which actually has the colored glazes on top. So sometimes I'll leave things be at this stage, and then go back to fix them later. Usually that's easier to do with highlights than with shading, because with shading you're either darkening the color that's already there or adding black. And that can cause some sort of color problems. But usually adding white and lightening things up is a little bit more forgiving to do step to execute in the later stages when the work is much closer to being completed. Simply by not applying the highlight step to the inside back of his jacket, which shows there with the tails, that'll immediately make it recede somewhat because it doesn't have that layer of work popping it out like the rest of the design does. So that sort of by absence of work, it's doing work for me. When the material's shining or glistening, I usually want to have the highlights to be a little bit sharper and also get sort of a reflected light on the underside of it. That'll be brought out more in the later stages after the glazing, but I'm still thinking about that at this point. Areas like in the upper left there where the viscera are sort of just a tangled, almost formless mess at this point. You can sort of move over that and treat that rather vaguely, but it still has to have a sense of something going on in terms of form and structure. So I'm not entirely sure exactly how those tubes have tangled in like that, but I've got a basic structure of looping in and out, which I'm then able to shade, and it actually can take more form in the later finishing steps than it really had laid out at the drawing stage. You'll notice I'll just go to history here and basically undo some of the last steps I made. It's easy to overdo this stage, to bring things out and highlight things too much, because everything has to be in relation with its adjoining parts. So if something's too bright or too highlighted or too contrasted in its form, it'll end up really standing out and imbalancing the whole picture. So you constantly have to zoom in and out, check that, and make sure you haven't overdone certain sections, especially when parts are sort of hazing off and going behind other parts. You'll actually maybe want to move out and not do any highlighting on that. It'll knock that part back, subdue it, and it'll appear to move around behind something else that you have brought forward with extra highlighting and detail. Areas like this scout where you're sort of introducing a second face, you'll actually want to underdo a little bit in comparison to the main character's face, so that it doesn't detract or pull the viewer's eye away from what you want the real focus to be. So usually it's a little bit less detailed. Again, when I can get away with it, I try to avoid doing stock straight highlighting, like on the stocks of the muskets. It tends to really catch the viewer's eye when you have these perfectly straight, sort of machined elements of line work mixing in with the rest of your hand-done line work. So when I think I can get away with it and consistently represent it, I'll end up just doing straight lines by hand. It's especially suitable when you're dealing with things like wood, where you have more of an organic variance inherent in the material. But then I've actually broken that rule for the straight edges of the metallic bayonets. To maintain that blank, empty look I really want from him because he's a corpse, I'm going to end up leaving the eyes sort of clouded over and milky, or with a cataract over them. So they'll be white. I'm not going to put any iris or pupil in there, and I'm probably not even going to add too much detail like blood vessels or anything. I'm going to leave them just these sort of clean, pearly orbs. Oftentimes, the best way to accentuate a shadow is to just put an exaggerated highlight just adjoining the lip that leads to the crevice or the inset that you want to really sort of deepen as you're doing this highlighting process. So even though we're using a tool designed for highlights, I'm still actually going through it with a concern for the shade as well, for the dark parts, because all of these different bits of value play off of each other. So I'm constantly switching back and forth and applying highlights for the sake of shadow and vice versa. You can see here that I'm already playing that the dark fur hat is going to be overall a very collectively sort of uniform patch. So I'm not going in here to add any major highlighting. Even though the whole thing is comprised of fur, I'm leaving it at sort of at the shading stage. Now that I'm going in and developing this intricate design work more, I'm actually sort of introducing more detail in it every step. So it was quite loose beforehand. It was basically working with these curves, and I was spending more time making sure that it was symmetrical. But now I'm actually introducing more detail, bringing out some of the shapes that were vaguely there already, and balancing out any imperfections in the symmetry. Now, in the actual reference, this sort of area here would actually be a metal plate with some engravings on it. I've sort of twisted that and turned it into a thick piece of gold cloth with embroidery, and I've also enlarged it, slightly changed the shape, and made up my own patterning for it. So the treatment here is sort of in a direction I'm going on my own, and I've decided that that was where I was going to take it, and now I'm having to treat it in a basically completely independent way. Even though I invented the patterning that was used on the embroidered part of the front hat, I still wanted to make sure it was in keeping, since this is the character sort of set into an alternate history of our world. It's not a completely fantasy-based realm. So in terms of the styles and the additions I make, they have to match and sort of gel in with the other more accurate elements of the design. Now, these highlights I'm putting on the boots here are actually too much. They're overdone. They sort of balanced too much with the white pants and made the materials a little vaguer. So I got rid of those pretty much right after I tried them out. But you could see I was zooming in and out to check them. Okay, so now I'm just going to switch to the burn tool with the highlights, add in a few more generalized shadows, and then switch to midtones. Where I'm going to go in and darken the shadows that are already there just to add accentuation to them, and balance them out with the rest of the drawing a bit better. Frame especially areas like the face a bit more, so the face is brought out with its pale white skin sitting in a sort of nestled in a slightly darker area of the design. Bits of shadow like in his sleeve and between his fingers, and especially the fur hat. You can see that I've got the tool exposure set to 23%. I usually try and undershoot the amount that I'd probably end up actually applying, and then doing a couple of repeated passes to build that up. Gives me a little bit more ease and sort of leeway when I'm applying this shading. I want to be careful not to overdo it. It's safer to underdo it because then you can repeat the process to build it up. But if you overdo it, you're going to end up burning areas way too much. And then also the danger with these types of tools is you can end up unintentionally imbalancing out the whole shaded areas of the work. So the key here is to be sort of tentative and careful. Now I'm just quickly going to go in there and select and delete that small portion that I originally left in there and shouldn't have. There's nothing it correlates with in the background, so I'll just delete that and get rid of that on the selection mask I have below it as well. I mean, basically, I'm just in the last steps here, cleaning up the finished shaded version as much as I can before I move on to the glazes. I'm using the highlight burn tool to just tweak any little bits and level it out and make sure it works as a basic monochromatic, rather grayscale drawing. Okay, so now we're going to basically start the colored glazing. So I've created a group folder. I'm going to put all the colored glaze layers in that group folder. The group folder has been set to soft light, which will glaze over top of the drawing. And then I've gone back down to the shaded highlighted drawing, and I'm now giving it a deep red yellow tinge to it. This will add depth and warmth to the shadows where the glazes will then go over this. So that will actually end up showing through, basically affecting every color that goes on top of it, warming it up. So now I'm working with the basic blue of the jacket. I had a couple little quick tries there, trying to get just the right blue. Usually what you want to do is you want to understate colors at this point, slightly muted as opposed to overdone, and then we can bring those up and out later on if necessary. Certainly with this style I'm using on this type of art, the colors are usually on the muted side anyways. So I'm not being too careful with the application of color here. I'm just laying in blocks of basic color as I figure out the color scheme of the overall character. I've named them because there's going to be quite a few later on. I'm going to want to mix them up, maybe switch them, take some out. So I name them as I put them down. And right now I'm working with the major elements of the color scheme that'll be working here. So I'm actually going with a rather accurate, at least accurate to the inspiration of the uniform scheme here, with sort of a deep blue jacket and these white, the white pants and the white straps. The white actually, if you notice, is a sort of an off-white, ivory, creamy color. This looks a little bit more natural. It's less clean. It's obviously more of an organic fabric, and it works well with the rest of the textures and hues in the artwork. The skin is rather similar, but with a slightly warmer tinge, slightly more skin colored than the off-white I've been using for the cloth. Even if they're very close, just slight subtle shifts like that will make a big difference if you see them side by side. And when we add more colors later on to add to the complexity of the hues in the design, it'll end up showing up the previous decisions. Again, now that I'm choosing a brown for the wood stocks of the muskets, even though there's going to be a fair amount of brown in the design, you're just going to want to shift the brown slightly for any other type of material that uses a brown hue in it. So when we do the leather here, it's got more of a yellow hue, which if you can see now as it's going almost side by side with the original musket stocks, it's really showing up the difference there. Even though they're both basic subdued browns, the hue shifts separate them, and they'll separate them significantly later on when we add more complexity to that. Now we're adding the deep red to the inner lining of the jacket. There's going to be a little bit of blood and viscera later on, so we're going to have to make sure that that's different from the red being used in the jacket, so it doesn't look like his jacket's soaked from the inside or something. That it is the fabric that's that color. So here I'm basically using the same hues on what I'd consider to be made of the same materials. So this this sort of these tassels on the epaulets and his scarf coming down from his waistline are all sort of assumed to be the same material. Okay, so now I'm choosing the hue that's going to be used on the bracket fungus that's growing out of him. This is a pretty bizarre element of the design, so I'm accentuating that so that it really stands out. It's obviously not part of him. It's sort of erupting and growing out of him, and it's going to be separate. So I'm just turning those off and seeing. You could see there how loose they are over the whole thing. Now I've chosen the erase and I'm going back in and cleaning up the areas of that. I'll go back with the color sampler, get the exact color, and then go back, set it back to soft light, and continue to clean it up, going from the eraser and the paint tool to fill in any areas I've missed or gone outside of the area I actually wanted to paint. So now that I've basically got the major colors in this color scheme, I'm going in and being much more careful about it. Because I'm happy with the way it's all working together. Now it's time to be more detailed and careful with that application, and we're going to be adding in some complexity to it later. The color scheme you're going with has to suit the character to a certain sort of direct extent, because they'll illustrate a lot about how people perceive the character. As in this case, if I made him brighter and more vibrant outside of the clothing, in terms of his skin and everything, he probably would have gotten a sort of speedier presence developing, as opposed to this desiccated, slow, subdued, kind of dull personality that shows up in the way that he himself has been treated. It's a good idea to echo elements of your color scheme throughout the design to unify it. So if it's assumed to be the same type of material and the same type of white, you go through and patch all those in together so that they sort of play off of each other and echo. If I really want to accentuate a shadow, I'll actually go in oftentimes and erase the color glazing that goes over top of that particularly deep or dark crease, or an area I really want to bring out and frame with a darker outline. Now, I could have created a palette of swatches with these specific colors separate, so I could always go back and dip into them if I needed to fix up areas or fill in an area I missed. But the colors tend to change in a very fluid and organic way when I'm doing this process. So I might change the whole skin one layer in hue slightly, and that would, as I'm working on it, as other things change, I may increase the reds and the shadows of the actual drawing, and that would end up changing how all the colors on top of it work. So oftentimes I don't want to anchor myself to a specific palette of colors which I've decided ahead of time, since I'm not entirely sure always how they'll end up applying, especially when they start interacting with multiple layers of colored glazes. Now I'm going in and being careful to erase any of the leather that shows through on the brass buttons. Sometimes I may want to leave an underlying layer of the overall object showing through, and then add layers on top of that if the material changes. Places like skin, especially, are areas where you'll want the basic hue to sort of shine through. But on certain things like that, you don't want the leather showing through on the brass buttons. It'll just muddy the entire effect because there's a stark difference between the two materials. So there shouldn't really be much of a connection in terms of hue outside of the underlying red warmth that we've already put into the drawing. Now, sometimes I may want to create more mask selections to separate some of these different elements that I'm now having to go in and clean up. If I created a mask beforehand, I would have all these places sort of sectioned off, and then I could work in them without worrying about spilling out into other areas. I tend to find that having a looser application of color unifies the whole picture well, despite the time spent cleaning it up like I'm doing here. You could see there how I used a large gradated airbrush tool to apply this color, and some of it was kind of spilling out and it was pretty messy. didn't conform to the areas that specifically needed the paint. And the reason for this is it's sort of that more generalized application of color is actually more forgiving, and it can end up looking better when mixed together with other areas. If you had this straight line of color change, that's actually much more eye-catching and noticeable than sort of this overall gradation or a lessening of color, or a slight sort of local light bouncing off a nearby object and slightly coloring it. So by being a bit looser that way, it can actually add to the impression given in the final stages. Now the brass buttons are going to be metallic, so we want a at least a noticeably different hue application from the gold cloth that we've been using elsewhere in the design. So as long as it's immediately there's a slight shift, the treatment later on will add to that, and they'll definitely be separate materials and separate entities within the design. You can get a basic idea of where the major color scheme is going, even at this point, but everything's sort of washed out and pretty pale. Nothing really has any presence. The red sort of does, because it's sort of compounding with the original red we put on the drawing. That's okay, because you have to get basically an idea of the direction you're going with it anyways. All of these colors are going to get much more rich and deeper as we go on and as we add more steps to it. So a lot of this stage is basically imagining where you're going to go with it, and then imagining if what you're doing now is going to work. Most of the design is quite warm in temperature, and then other parts of it, which I really want to sort of strike the viewer, things like the cold steel of the bayonets, sort of break that consistency and really stand out as they're supposed to, as they sort of project and jut out of them. They also play off the colors and stand out in that sense as well. Especially with the small basis and ring of red that's going to kind of anchor them to the body. So there's going to be this base accentuation as the colder colors come out and indicate a completely different sort of alien body projecting from them. You can see here that since I'm happy with that glaze, it's just a bit too bright. I can just go up to the opacity and change it back and forth, and check to see if lessening it improves the impression given. And then, of course, if 100% opacity isn't good enough, I can actually end up duplicating that glaze and compounding it on top of the previous one. And then even within that, I can actually compound it, and then on the second glaze, lower that opacity so I can get sort of 150% of the basic original layer. Now, here I'm actually going to start some compound layers. So this is the second skin layer that's going to lay on top of the hue we've already put down. So I'm adding some blue in the hollows of the face and in other portions of the skin that'll actually bring out the original warmer color. And we're actually going to go in and add some more hues to the skin too, because the skin is so important to convey, and it's such a focus of the design. That here's a third skin layer where we're actually going to add in some sort of bruised reddening that goes in oftentimes with the blue. Some areas get more of it: the nose, place where the blood might pool, around the gums and the lips, and in the crevices of the holes in them, and places like that, and just a sort of a spattering around other parts of the skin. We're also going to use that for a little bit, sort of a soaked amount of blood on the white strap, and in some other portions of the clothes, a little bit on the edges of the bayonet, and also to set some of those shadows back down here. You'll notice with this type of soft light layer glazing that the darker hues often darken the line and the value that is being applied over top of, and of course with the lighter hue, it'll bring the value up when I lay it on, as you could see with the whites earlier. So you have to keep that in mind when you're doing the shading step, that it will end up changing depending on the direction you're going to go with this. So that's one of the reasons we kept it rather sort of a level or a contained level of grays, which now the glazes are actually punching out or punching back as we lay them on. Additions like that warm pink to the edge of the hand and other parts of the skin actually, when used in moderation in very small touches, can bring forth the pale characteristic of the skin to further accentuate it by the absence of pink everywhere. You could see here I basically couldn't tell that yellow wasn't going to work until I actually applied it, and then I just went into the history, rolled it back, and then adjusted the color in the direction I think would work better, and went back and reapplied it. Just sparse little additions like this blue applied here can really bring out objects and separate them from the sort of rather subdued color scheme that's going on. In these subdued color schemes, those little touches of color are actually end up being quite noticeable. Now just to set back certain areas I wanted to make darker, I'm actually going to add a very dull and brown just here to the fur hat and maybe some other areas with similar materials. The black boot ends below the boot covers, and this achieves two ends where it darkens it, which is what I wanted to do, but it also sets the brown hue apart from any surrounding browns a little bit more. Later on, I might go in with the highlight dodge tool and then actually add sort of a shining highlight to those boots if they were really polished. In this case, they're kind of mucky and dulled, so I'm probably not going to do that step on anything but the metallics and the glistening elements. Now I'm just going to add some stains for where he's sort of split open in the middle there, coming down those white pants, because they're just far too clean at this point. I want to keep them relatively white, but have this sort of spill effect that's trailing down from the middle. It'll bring out the hanging intestines a bit more, and it'll give them more of a setting and a surrounding that makes sense in its context. Especially when I'm working with a layer like stains, I'm just going around quickly and applying it and dirtying up his clothes a bit to make them look a little bit more worn, yellowing the leathers and the white parts of the cloth. This also unifies it to a certain extent and ties some of the colors together. If one part is stained a certain hue, that stain's probably going to show up in other areas of his clothing. Now here I'm just going to actually add sort of a peachy salmon colored highlight to the blue. This adds some more interest to a relatively flat application of color, brings out the form a little more, and I might apply it to some other areas here down on the boot and on the front of the chest. Adding extra colors on this are actually quite good for accentuating the original base color you applied. So even if you're absolutely positively happy with that type of blue or whatever base color you've put in, it's still a good idea to take a different color that complements it and then lay that on top to accentuate the original base to really bring it out. When working with these glaze layers, you can actually take a layer like this stain I've taken and duplicate it and lay it over top to further saturate an application of glazes that you've already made. You can then move the opacity up and down from this to quickly fine-tune it to how you want. But if a color seems right but just not quite powerful or vibrant enough, that's usually a good way to quickly solve it by sort of double layering it. Now the staining of the clothes is basically the sort of final step I'm taking with the glazes, so we're finishing that up. Okay, so now I'm going to merge the entire piece of art, basically outside of the background. I've used the original selection of the silhouette to then take that, invert it, and delete the mess around the outside, because this character is going to be layered on top of a base frame or paper texture, which we'll be adding later. I'm quickly changing the balance again because it's been bugging me. He was just tipping over a little bit too much. And now I'm affecting the levels. Getting the darks a bit darker, bringing the whites down a tiny bit. And now I'm adding a little bit more hue in the color balance. I'm adding some more warmth again to the shadows, and then trying to bring out the blue of the jacket a little bit more, because they seem to be playing off each other rather well. I'm now using the burn midtones tool to just go in and balance out some of the value within this. You don't want to overdo this step at all, because it can really mess up the colors, and it dirties them somewhat. So really sort of subtle dusting here is what I'm applying. Not too much, more to bring out the drawing. You don't want to end up changing the colors too much, simply just darkening them or brightening them a little bit. So I'm looking around and finding any areas that need more balancing out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to find this this paper texture I've scanned. It's an old piece of paper from the 50s, I think. I scanned it as high resolution as I thought I could get away with without making it too ridiculously big, because it's usually going to be bigger than the actual size of the drawings you work on, since it surrounds them and frames them and the drawings lay on them. You want the resolution at least matched, if not greater. You can always work with greater. So I've taken a selected bit of that. I'm using these creases as edges here, so I've deleted that, tilted it so that it was aligned straight with the character. There was some old text showing through the other side of the paper, so I'm just going in with the rubber stamp tool and removing that. I'm affecting the levels of the paper, slightly brightening it up. It was a little bit too gray and dull, so we'll be doing more of that later. And now I'm just cleaning up the edges of the frame. So I'm going in with the eraser tool at a small level and just carefully getting the right ragged, soft edge as I'm going down. I'm also going back to the rubber stamp tool and cleaning up that text. It's a good idea for over time to slowly sort of gather together a collection of these backed framings that you can move to when you need them, and also a sort of a variation of what you're going to use. They don't necessarily have to be paper. I tend to use paper a lot because it works well and it tends to look really good, but I'll often use sheet metal, bits of old rusted pieces of things, leather, cloth, things like that, and I'll even multi-layer a lot of things on top of themselves to achieve a specific look I'm going for. So papyrus or something, you sort of have to end up faking by mixing together different elements on top of each other. This is relatively straightforward because we're just going for old worn paper. I will end up actually adding something to this, but it's initially already pretty much spot on for what I want. After a while, you'll probably find yourself gravitating back to the same consistent back textures that you often use, just because they seem to really suit your working style and your art. So now, since we don't really have an edge on the bottom of the paper, I'm going to take the top, copy that, I'm going to flip it vertically, bring it down, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a nice soft airbrush on there on the eraser tool and blend it in with the bottom and sort of basically transplant that edge onto the bottom of the piece of work. Make sure it matches up. Take out any, if you have major dots or sort of blotches on these transplanted parts, you're going to want to get rid of them so it doesn't look mirrored. So I'm just going in and cleaning up any extra little bits I've missed. Now I'm going to take the overall paper and rotate it and size it slightly so that it matches up with the character proportionally a bit better, and it balances out with them. Frames them nicely with plenty of room, but without not too much empty space. Now I've taken another texture. This is a piece of old worn leather. This is going to be a very subtle addition. It doesn't look so at this point, but I'm going to really bring that down. And this is basically just to add a little bit more warmth. And sometimes when you're dealing with files this big, it can take a while to perform these actions. But mostly it'll be adding a textural complexity to the original paper, making it look older, grainier, sort of adding this patina surface to everything. We're going to reduce it slightly when it overlays the character, but we will actually be maintaining it on top of the character as well. This will also uniform the character with the background paper you've added, so it doesn't look like he's sort of floating on top of a piece of paper, but that he's actually part of this one piece, that he's been at least depicted on this original piece of paper. So we're just going to use the original paper picture as a guide with the magic wand, just cleaning up that selection to basically get rid of the edges of the added leather texture. So we're going to delete that, clean that up. You can really go on and on dealing with these sort of textured backings. And I've sometimes, depending on what I'm trying to achieve, ended up piling on upwards of 5 to 10 different layers, all interacting with each other in different ways, some almost imperceptibly, but just add a little bit. In this case, it's all been relatively straightforward, but if I wasn't happy with this, I might start piling on more layers and knocking back some of the old ones. Here I'm just going to lighten up the paper texture around him, give him a slight halo. This will make him sit up off the page. You have to be careful you don't overdo this and you don't separate him from what you basically want him to be a part of. But with a little subtle work here, you can actually really pop him out without disconnecting him. One of the difficulties with having that nice ragged edge to the outside of the paper is that it's hard to crop in, so if you don't want it floating on white. In this case, I could probably get away with it by cropping slightly into the image, but if I put in more rips and tears, that might introduce some problems if you want it cropped on a different background. Now, just as an added little step, I'm going to add a blood trail, a splatter of blood hanging down from that scalp, just to give more of a sense of a ground plane, even though it's not depicted, the way his feet rest on it and the way this scattered dribble of blood will definitely imply a ground plane within the picture, which will give him a more sense of existence and stability. Plus, it's an interesting design element that slightly curls around the back of his foot and echoes off of the reds that are present in him. In fact, this is probably the biggest patch of blood you can see anywhere on the design. So I've just laid it in loosely with the paintbrush, and now I'm going in and slightly cleaning up the edges where it was a bit messy, getting the pooling to work right in the loose perspective I'm using, and zooming in and out to make sure that the whole thing works and serves the picture. Now I'm just going to deal with the levels of the paper texture, because it's a little bit too dominant right now. It's overshadowing the character as opposed to accentuating him and framing him as much as I'd like. So I'm actually darkening the darks at this point, bringing those up, reducing some of the saturation, because you don't want it being richer in hue than the actual character that it's that's sitting in it. I'm using the burn midtones tool to just darken up the edges. Give the ground plane a bit more of an accentuation, a bit more of a presence, even though it's not actually depicted, just darkening the lower area. It gives it weight to the overall depiction as well. The bottom is weightier and it gets brighter as it moves up and sort of frames his head. So I'm just flipping back and forth and checking that, making sure that each little step I take as I sort of ease this in the direction I want to take it is actually working. So it's rather tentative at this point. You're just sort of getting a feel for it, because the whole point of the texture is to serve the character. I mean, that's all it's there for. It's to support it and bring out the character and add to it. It itself shouldn't be, if anything, it should be more toned down than you'd like, just to be careful. Now what I'm going to do is just apply an unsharp mask to bring out the crispness in the character. You want to leave this step right until the end, because you're just going to be wanting to accentuate what you've been working on. You don't want to do it at an early point where you're accentuating the grain of the original drawing, because you want it to apply to basically the finished project, as well as the paper equally, because you definitely don't want portions of it being crisper, noticeably crisper than other portions, if they're supposed to be sort of mixing together, as all of this is supposed to be unified. I'm just going in now with the Dodge Highlights tool to just bring out little shines on any parts of the design, especially the brass buttons, and then give it a big I'm just checking that and make sure it works. Sort of a large sweep over the focal point of the design. That'll bring it out quite a bit and brightens it up and attracts the eye to it more. Now that I'm relatively happy with all that, I'm going to use the rubber stamp tool and just clean up any of the rough edging in the merging between the paper and the character. This is just to get rid of any of that rough, grainy edging. Sometimes you want that, so we'll actually be keeping it in some cases. If it's ragged cloth, parts of hair, things like that, you don't want to clean those up usually outside of sort of major blotchy bits. But certain things like the smooth brass buttons, you'll definitely want to just clean up as you go. We're just scanning over it. I'm leaving the sort of the ragged boots, some of the ragged edging. Anything sharp that's become exceptionally pixelated, or that little bit where it's sort of curled over like a hair, you definitely want gone. Bits of the wood especially, you want that smoothed out. There's some little areas that should have been cleaned up earlier that we're just going to clean up now. You have to be careful depending on how complicated your background framing is. This is going to be a more difficult job, but luckily it's overall uniform, this paper texture I'm using, so I don't have to be too careful with this cleanup job. But if the hues or the values change dramatically on the background it was sitting on, I'd have to be much more careful about how what areas I use the rubber stamp on to transplant up against the edges. Now here I'm actually going in with the rubber stamp and working from the inside out. So I'm filling in areas of the fur hat that seem to have dipped in too far and show too much of the paper through it. So I'm just zooming out here, switching over to burn midtones again, balancing it out as I go through it. Zooming in and out to get a feel for it. This is a part, this is the later stages. So you're sort of tweaking bits here and there and seeing how the whole thing works together. I'm just quickly going to crop the whole picture now, down up to the edging, and we can have a look at it. Zoom in, see how the whole thing works together. Okay, so now we basically got the extra view scanned in, again at 800 dpi. This especially you may want to bring down to a lower dpi just for speed while working on it. We're going to be putting them all together, but cleaning them up one at a time as we go through them. So I'm just performing the same process here again, selecting the character to delete that ambient texture around this. And I'm giving a nice large work area that they can all exist in of white. I didn't invert it there, so now I'm inverting it and getting rid of the outside. Again, I'm tweaking it to match the balance. If you notice this time it's actually a mirrored tweaking, so both of them were slightly imbalanced in the same direction in relation to the character, not in relation to the viewer. So we want to be more careful with the shading in these because the drawings are originally significantly smaller than the other steps in this process. So we'll actually be adding to the detail of the drawing a little bit more with the shading step in this case. So we're going to be zooming in quite a bit farther and being a bit more careful with how we apply these lights and darks to bring out elements of the drawing and fix some of the vagaries of the scan drawing. It's also key that we balance out the shading and everything to do with each one of these rotations so that they match up side by side. So I'm actually going through and doing each basic step on each rotation as opposed to finishing a single rotation then moving on to the next. So I'm working on them all in conjunction. You'll also notice that on the rotations I've actually removed the muskets. So the holes that the muskets sort of sit in are still there, so you can still sort of see their positioning. But for the sake of the rotation, I've actually removed them so you can get a clearer view of the zombie's uniform and anything that's obscured by those hanging over them. Since the musket has been detailed in the extra shots earlier on, the modeler can look at those and then actually simply sort of fit them into the slots that are present on these orthographic rotations. Even though I won't end up glazing these or coloring these, I'm still taking into account from the original color version, sort of getting an idea for how the values should balance out in relation to each other. So elements like the darker boots and the dark fur hat are sort of balance out against the pale skin and the white pants, and I try and keep that consistent amongst all the designs, so at least it reads in proportion. You can see here how just going in with some shading can really bring out more of the detail in the face. Simply using small areas of texture, which was laid in with the pencil, I can go in and accentuate that where I want it, and it implies a lot more complexity than what was initially present. There's nothing too complicated going on with those holes going through them where the muskets have been removed. If I made them too large or open, there'd be too much leeway for the muskets to move within him, which wouldn't work if he ends up getting animated. It would cause too many problems, and it would look like they should just fall out if that was the case. So it's a pretty tight seal around them when they're in there. You may have noticed, and I just realized that I've actually been shading. I'm shading right here on the actual drawing level. So I'm just going to switch that back up to the shading level. It's not a big deal. It's not that big of a mistake because I haven't actually had to use that as a recourse in any of the previous steps. It's just sort of there in case I've ended up having a really bad run at it, and I haven't saved enough of the actual file steps or snapshots to go back. I can actually, and also I can sort of accentuate or exaggerate the shading level independently of the line level. So if I want to bring it up because I'm finding the line is getting lost underneath the coat of shading, I can do that. But again, I seem to be sort of getting a hold of this and getting a feel for it. This is in a later stage, so I'm used to what I'm trying to do with this particular design and character. So it wasn't that big of a deal. It's more of a sort of a safety measure as opposed to something that's absolutely necessary in the process of the artwork. Again, even though the actual aesthetic impression of the illustration is less of an issue with this, a lot more care and work goes into focal point areas like the face, the eyes, the mouth, and the hands, and areas like that, because there's such points of importance that they get an extra bit of rendering and detailing in comparison to the rest of the entire design. The entire digital process that I've been using so far is actually relatively simple. Most of the steps are straightforward and sort of consistently done again and again and again with no major changes depending on what I want to do. I find the advantage of this is that it's really versatile. You're not totally limited on the complexities of your process. And you can apply this same techniques that I've been showing here to a huge range of different sort of themes and styles in your concept work. So all the applications on this sort of period costume zombie this entire process can be applied just as easily and just as successfully to say a futuristic tank or a robot or something sort of out of the same theme that this is. It's not hinging upon that style. All of the elements, sort of the rough organic elements, can still end up applying to the robot with there are different design concerns, of course, but none of the process really has to fundamentally change. And the great thing about that is that it allows you to really focus on the ideas and the artwork as opposed to focusing on, how am I going to execute that? What sort of hitches am I going to what in my process am I going to have to change to achieve the look I want? The application that I've been using that I'm used to simply won't be congruous with this new conceptual direction I may have to take. Of course, that advantage carries through, again, back to the original traditional means, which was on the first DVD. That pencil work and everything leading up to this, again, is totally versatile. You can apply it to anything you can really imagine. What's interesting is I'm actually sort of working at the same magnification I used for the much bigger earlier stages of the design. So the other drawings, which were drawn bigger, were sort of around this size on my screen while I was working on them. So you can definitely see the major difference between how the line work comes across now that it's been scanned and we're looking at it at more of a zoom in this case. So it's much cruder and thicker and rougher. And a lot of this highlighting and shading is actually just sort of having to rework over top of a lot of the original pencil work as I go through it, more so with the original when I was being extremely careful to ensure that I preserved the original line work because it was so key to the sense of design and the character. Again, here you're more concerned with conveying the hand position that we've already settled on. So the success of the gesture at this angle isn't really important in an aesthetic sense. So I'm just mimicking things that have been solved already. It's important that, of course, the sketching gesture is fluid and has movement and good structure to it. But I'm not too concerned about how pleasing it is at these angles. These are purely utilitarian depictions. You'll definitely find that if you're using a process or a technique that you're not completely familiar with, it's okay if things sort of take a little bit more time than this. I'm really sort of going through this because I know how it's going to end up. I know all the little tricks and techniques I'm going to use in this because I've done them so many times before on different projects. That can really streamline the process. That's sort of from an accumulation of a lot of work over a long period of time. So, and it's also been settled. So earlier on, I was sort of still trying to figure out processes and techniques as I went along, and that would oftentimes hinder the actual conceptual process in the work. But once you're really used to it, the work can proceed extremely smoothly, and you can really focus on the fun art aspect of it. Well, I do like to get very obsessive and focused on something and sort of finish it through in one go if I can, which usually isn't possible. It takes so long to do a lot of these things. Um, Sometimes when you've been working for a really extended period of time, you can get a little sick and a little sort of fatigued when doing the same type of things again and again. So I tend to sort of jump around if I can to different areas of the project to give myself sort of a reprieve from doing clothing folds, highlights, seemingly unendingly. So I'll run around and do some buttons for a while. But again, your hand can really end up cramping up from doing little circular repetitive motions like that with your tablet. Usually this whole process sort of goes in three main segments where I start wide out, lay in general shade, and then zoom in, do details, and then pull out and do another general step to sort of unify everything and make sure it's all working together. And that sort of three-part series will actually get repeated as I go through. So repeated for the shading, and then repeated again for the highlighting, and then that three-step probably even shows up in stages like the glazing. One of the real key things I had to take care with, of course, with these rotations, they all sit on the exact same angle of a ground plane. Um, if the ground plane is shifting, it's going to give it a very weird look, and they're not going to look like they're properly in relation to each other, lined up, one next to the other. So now that we finished that up, we're just going to go in and fiddle with the levels and get it balanced in a way that I'm happy with, and of course do an unsharp mask to crispen it up. Um, that's actually an especially important step if this is planned on going to print. You might want to actually slightly over sharpen it slightly just for the sake of print. Give it a print test and see how it turns out if you can, to see how it goes. But oftentimes you might want to edge a little bit onto the side of oversaturation and over sharpening just a tiny bit, because printing tends to lose a little bit of that in the transfer from the monitor. So now I'm just going in and cleaning it up. That's especially important with these rotations because they were drawn at a smaller scale. The pencil sort of grain on the outside of the silhouette is exceptionally rough here, and there's even some large sort of areas that haven't been cleaned up completely. Um, this is, of course, also really helpful if we're going to make a selection of this and lay it over some sort of background or framing later on, because we can make a clean selection, a clean magic wand selection around this. When you do make a magic wand selection of something like that, if you want to do that, don't forget to always go to select and do a little expand, maybe by 1 or 2 pixels, just to sort of widen it out. You can fiddle with the tolerances too, but I tend to find expand and contract a little bit more helpful when making large selections using the magic wand. Now, I actually won't be adding any of those extra textures, so I won't be adding that leather texture over top of it to add sort of this element of extra interest to its surfaces, simply because this is much more of an informative type of illustration. Its appearance is sort of subservient to what it communicates technically about the design. So the concerns of how good it looks as a standalone illustration is much less than in the earlier front-on views of the zombie. The cleanup stage can be really tedious going around doing this, but that's one of the reasons I oftentimes leave it till the end result, because it's quite rewarding to go through after you've completed the entire piece, clean it up just so it's sort of, you get this essence that you're just finishing off and it's just looking exactly how you wanted to make it. So basically now I've finished up all the art that's going towards this particular concept for this job. So it's all settled. I've finished up the final rotations for the modeler, and I'm going to send it around, get people's responses to this, and see how it is, and see if it really is settled, and we can go ahead with the next steps on this one. Now, this step is in response to the concerns that the fungus in the design of the zombie may not read very well at the kind of distances we're going to be seeing it, and may not model very well. And in hindsight, it may have made the character too busy and too convoluted. While it's a good part of the story and the reason behind the character's existence, I'm actually going back to the original drawing now to remove those. And we're going to be transplanting in the missing bits after removing the fungus. So it'll basically just be parts of the zombie we'll be putting back in after removing that. So I use an electric eraser at that first point there, the large thing. It rotates. I can get it into small areas and get it to very quickly and easily erase all that area. I'm going in with the handheld eraser now to do a bit more of a precise job. Probably not totally necessary on that second drawing there. I could have done that in the computer. And now when I'm going in with the pencil again and finishing up the bits that are missing, I had a little musket ball in there. So his jaw's kind of, now instead of his jaw being distended from the fungus, it's actually been shot. So it's sort of knocked to the, that explains why it's still knocked to the side, because the base of the jaw is still in the same position, and I'm filling in the gap between. So I'm filling in the other part of his collar there, which was obscured before. And then when the strap goes up over his shoulder. So now I'm going down to here, the chest. I'm probably going to make that a big cavity to keep this sort of dark area, because it was accentuated before. It's going to be accentuated now actually through a big shadow. So we've got the little bit of his inner jacket coming down there, and then some meat, and then the slight hinting of the inner ribs. And then we got some sort of organs that have sunken down inside his chest cavity here that we're going to be piling up. So we've got those there. We're just going to lay those in and then get some shadow above them. Finish the coat coming down the other side too. And that has to connect up with the original drawing as well. So keeping your drawing consistent and accurate is a big help if you need to go back in and transplant parts, because hopefully things will link up, even if it doesn't look like they'll need to. It could end up paying off later on. And it certainly works, it helps visually anyways, even if you're not going to be having to do this. And there's basically the finished characters. Now we're going to go over to the orthographics. This is a more precise job here. You're going to have to be a bit more careful. We may spill out into other parts of the drawing, which we'll have to redraw. But again, the only part that needs a lot of work basically to change this element of the design is the front view. So I'm going in there and precisely getting rid of that after using the electric eraser, and I'm going to end up drawing in the same elements I've just drawn in before. So I came up with the conceptual solution in the first stage, which I'm just carrying through to each of these extra views now. So, but I'm going to have to keep it consistent. The musket ball is going to have to be there. The jaw is going to have to be at the same angle. His right edge of the collar is going to have to be pushed back farther. And I'm going to have to keep that consistent and in relation with the rest of it during each view. So I'm just adding in the jacket there, that little bit of the inner jacket that comes down on his right. And then, of course, those two sort of major slumping organs on the inside there that are still hanging down to the same angle. And I'm just going to quickly fix up his jaw there. There's not much to it. Just cleaning that up. And that's it. The character isn't heavily changed. Now for the extra view, we've got that main piece of fungus coming out in the one at his neck. So I'm removing that. And you're going to have to balance the jaw out a bit there. In cases like this, while it may look immediately like simply removing the fungus will work, we're actually going to have to do some fixing here to bring that end up, add in what should be present now that the fungus is gone. So we're going to put his tongue coming out, remove that up, and then we got sort of the weird shattered angle it's got going on there, and just going over any bit that became reduced because of the sort of collateral erasing around the area that we removed. So we're just going back in and detailing that up. So now we're back to the original finished art, which we're going to be transplanting these fixes into. So we've got the scan drawing, same DPI and everything, so that's kept it consistent and quick. And we're just going to make small selections of the areas that have changed, bring them in, put them on a layer over top, and then actually put them onto a multiply layer. And see when it sort of gets crisp, because then it's overlaying rather accurately. We're going to have to do probably a little bit of sizing because we changed the face earlier, if you remember. So we're going to have to adjust for that, and maybe a bit of tilting because it might not have been scanned at the exact right angle as it was the first time. So we're just making sure it overlays, flipping it on and off quickly, sort of strobing it. Will give you an indication because it'll appear to shift slightly if it's not aligned. Don't worry so much about the outside parts, or at least the parts we're not fixing. So now I'm going in with the eraser tool and removing the parts that we don't want to have to fix. We certainly don't want to have to redo anything we don't need to. So we're going to get it in as close as possible to the modified sections, while maintaining at least a clean, smooth transition between them and the other one, because they have to mix well together. There can't be a sort of a seam appearing. So we're just strobing it there to see how that relates and lines up with the rest of the original drawing. And it seems to be pretty good, so now we need to go in and clean that up. As you're deleting sections of it, you'll want to be careful that you're doing a thorough job. You don't want little flecks of white or gray being present that you've missed. You're sort of adding to it, adding this ugly noise to the overall design later on. We're going to have to go in and get rid of that projecting fungus later after we've cleaned that up. But once we've gotten the transplant aligned. So yeah, I'm using the rubber stamp tool now to get rid of that, smooth it out so that the paper texture's there, and make sure that it'll mix well with that. Erase it up to that point on the transplant. The thing that should be noted about this change too is that they're not major additions. They're more like sort of minor subtractions to the design. It's extremely difficult and a whole separate issue. If something big has to be added to the design, it may end up severely imbalancing the design. It'll look tacked on. There are all sorts of really horrible complications that can develop if that's the case. But for this, it's basically taking one of the aspects and removing them and replacing them with the sort of characteristics that we've already spent time laying down. So it's a pretty smooth transition from one to the other. It's they're sizable chunks that we're replacing, but conceptually wise, the modifications weren't too serious. If they become too serious, you might even have to completely redo it. Okay, now I'm just going to go into layers, darken up the line work so that it mixes well with the darks on the original piece of art. Sort of going through a quick process that we've gone through before, but this time for much more localized, specific areas. And also, we have an advantage because it's we're keying it into the existing drawing. So while that can add challenges, it can also sort of add a touch point for this stage of the work, because you just need to get it to mix. So you're sort of always able to reference something that's right near it. So we're going in, shading it, making sure it blends into the point where it joins in terms of value. And then we'll be glazing that using later steps. Luckily with this modification, I've maintained and still worked with the idea of him being hollowed out here, so it really recedes it in terms of the design. But it could have caused problems if his jacket, say, would have continued down in the design. That stark area of white with brass buttons leading down it probably would have ended up causing some issues with it really catching the eye. I could have there was sort of a myriad of solutions I could have ended up solving it with. Maybe it was covered with a deep, dark stain all down the front of it. Or maybe he was carrying some sort of satchel or purse coming down from the inside of his jacket that went over it. But you do have to take issue with those kind of details ahead of time before you start adding in these modifications, because it'll be quite a hassle if you end up doing all this work to put in these modifications and then discovering that it kind of messes up the rest of the design. You can see here I've reintroduced the idea of a tongue, which wasn't present at all in his jaw beforehand. So that's sort of, I was considering going with more of a swollen or a lolling one, hanging out the side of his broken jaw maybe, but it was decided that might be a little bit too eye-catching, a little bit too distinct, and kind of piling too many ideas on top of an already detailed area of the design, where I wanted the viewer to focus on other elements. Certain editions like the musket ball I think are really good because they echo with the fact that he's already been damaged by that type of weaponry before. The one part that stands out in that sense, of course, is this carved open abdomen, and that might imply that that's been inflicted by a fellow zombie or some other type of situation which supports the storytelling in this case. I mean, there's this whole sort of event or action scene that could have sort of built up to why he looks the way he does now. Okay, so the transplanted layers, I'm going to warm up their shadows, give them that rich, deep hue that the drawing originally had. Already you can see it merges into the drawing much better. It seems to mix well. Now I'm going to bring up one of the save steps of the process. Switch the entire group back to normal instead of soft light, so I can get an accurate color pick of the original hues I used in the glazes. So I just grabbed the brass for the buttons there. I'm going to transplant that now into a new soft light grouping that I've got on the new one. So just layering that on top, and then color picking what I want and seeing if it mixes well. Basically, the good thing about this is you can eyeball it literally side by side with the original hues, and then tweak them if you need to, if they don't seem to be matching up right. Luckily, in this situation, it's actually much easier transplanting something into an area with a lot of heavy shadow. So it's darker, it's sort of set into the character. Nothing's protruding out of him or anything like that's having to get changed. So that's actually, that's much more forgiving, especially to do with seams and things like that. If you can make the seams occur in points of shadow and dark areas, that's extremely beneficial to the process, and will cut down your modification time hugely. For some areas where it links up, you may not even want to use this sort of redoing process. If there's just a problem with a seam or a slight inconsistency in the transition, you may want to finish up the rest of it, flatten the image, and then end up using the rubber stamp tool to clone in areas and just merge them together in the final stages, as opposed to trying to laboriously rework it in this sequence. Of course, when you're working in these extra steps, you may end up noticing things that you should have tweaked earlier. So every time you revisit a design, you're probably going to be tempted to go in and fix things up and maybe change it a little from how it originally was. Make sure you don't end up overworking it or accidentally covering up elements that were working before that you may be overlooking at this point. But it's usually a good idea that you've got sort of a clean slate that you've returned to the design with, and then actually apply that sort of fresh view just to fix up any little areas that you think you may have overlooked in the original process. Now, just after finishing up the basic areas of the face and wrapping up any of the major elements and checking to make sure they work in, I'm going to see if I can overlay that leather texture to fill that in, because that's actually lacking at this point. That sort of permeated the rest of the character. So just for the sake of consistency, I'm going to check to see if I can lay it in, but it doesn't actually look like it's contributing enough to make the extra step worth it, and it seems to be merging rather well initially. It just needs to be crisped up. So here you can see I'm actually going in and reworking even parts of the drawing to add in that distinctive white element of the jacket that has to match up symmetrically with its adjoining counterpart. You can always get away with little things like maybe certain buttons missing or something like that, but you definitely want them at least seemingly aligned right in relation to each other. Just went in there and accentuated the musket ball. Since it's sort of an interesting new part of the design, it also has to be differentiated from the rest of the sort of, especially since you're dealing with this pulped mass in there with little bits of bone and tongue and meat and things like that. It has to be immediately apparent that this is sort of a metallic molded piece of a foreign material that's lodged in there and sort of stands out if you pay attention and look closely, as opposed to some sort of strange part of his anatomy. You really want to go in and make sure you clean up parts like those the fuzzy bits around that button. That sort of artificial digital airbrushed effect is really eye-catching, and it really stands out amongst other parts of the drawing. You can get away with more of the elements of the actual drawing, so that pencil grain being a little bit of a mess, and that may even add stuff or add an effect or a feel to the entire piece, but you definitely want to get rid of any of those sort of spillovers from the digital process. Now, after this sort of revisiting of the original piece of art, I've decided to up the levels and the saturation a bit more, bring the color out a bit more. It might have been too muted originally, certainly on things like printouts. It'll appear more muted than it does on the screen oftentimes, even when you have it calibrated accurately. So basically, here's the complete finished version. I believe actually the modifications came out to be a bit of an improvement on the overall design. It seems to read more immediately. So again, here we're just taking our original scans. In that case, it wasn't necessary because we could go in and erase them on the back view. But here we're going to put in the mouth, because that definitely changed. There's some details like the tongue that have gotten added in. So we're going to lay that over top, stroke that, and get it set up right. And then basically go in and follow the same process, cutting out as much as we possibly can, cleaning that up, and then merging the black and white. The patches I'm transplanting here are pretty big. More than I definitely needed. I'm cutting away the vast majority of them, but I just want to make sure that to save time that I'm including everything that may have changed, and then I can work it down to the digital steps. It's easier, of course, to take it out than to have to fill in little extra areas simply because I cut it out during the scanning phase. These extra views have been pretty quick to fix up. We just put in the musket ball there and finished up the cavernous mouth, and now I'm just simply erasing the projecting fungus from this version. So it was quick, and now it's finished. So here we've got the full scanned-in image again, and I'm just cutting bits out of that and transplanting them onto the each rotation that needs it, which is only the first two. Of course, if the problem had shown up or been decided upon, it could have been made at the line work stage, in which case you just would have worked from these new modified scans, but in this case we're going to have to transplant them. And really, that's just the whole process sort of wrapped up. So we've gone through the whole thing, done the traditional steps, scanned it, done the second half of each of these segments of the concept art, digitally painted them, and then we've actually gone back in and fixed it with some modifications, and we sort of have the final passed and accepted design for the monster, which is going to end up being taken through and made into a full 3D zombie in the next DVD. So thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something from this and you enjoyed the seeing my process and the way I work. And If you like, you can check this DVD in your computer and check out the actual art files of the finished artwork I've been producing during this entire sequence.